"I should have left you years ago," my husband said as he slid the divorce papers across the table during our 40th wedding anniversary dinner. The room went silent. Even the soft piano music drifting from the restaurant speakers seemed to disappear. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My son Ethan stared down at his plate. My daughter-in-law Vanessa looked at Richard, then at me, waiting for some kind of reaction. Maybe they expected tears. Maybe they expected anger. Instead, I smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that barely reaches the eyes. The kind of smile that comes when a person has been carrying the same burden for so long that one more stone no longer changes the weight. My name is Helen Carter. I am 62 years old, and that night was supposed to be a celebration of 40 years of marriage. The private dining room overlooked Lake Washington. The windows reflected hundreds of tiny lights dancing on the water. Fresh roses decorated the tables. The restaurant manager had even congratulated us when we arrived. To everyone around us, we probably looked like a successful American family. A husband, a wife, a grown son, a daughter-in-law, for people sharing an elegant dinner together. But appearances can be deceiving. Richard adjusted his suit jacket and folded his hands calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. "Helen, this is the right thing for both of us." His voice was steady, practiced. I realized then that he had rehearsed this moment, perhaps for weeks, maybe months. Ethan finally looked up. "Dad and I talked about this already," he said quietly. "We think it's time. We think." The words settled heavily in my chest. Not because they hurt, not because they surprised me, because they confirmed something I had known for years. Decisions about my life had been made without me for a very long time. Vanessa reached for her wine glass and took a careful sip. "You deserve a fresh start too, Helen," she said. Her tone sounded polite, almost compassionate, but there was something underneath it. Relief, perhaps, as though a long inconvenience was finally being removed. I looked around the table. The white tablecloth, the anniversary cake, waiting near the window, the silver candle holders. 40 years reduced to a stack of legal papers resting beside my dinner plate. Strange enough, I felt calmer than I had in years. Richard misread my silence. He always did. "The attorneys have prepared everything," he continued. "It's straightforward. Fair. We can avoid unnecessary complications. Fair." I nearly laughed. Instead, I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The ice cubes clinked softly against the side. I remembered another anniversary many years earlier. A tiny apartment. Cheap takeout. Folding chairs because we couldn't afford proper furniture. Back then, Richard used to look at me as though I mattered. Back then, he held my hand when he talked about the future. Somewhere along the way, that future became his alone. "Say something, Mom," Ethan said. His voice carried impatience now. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the boy whose nightmares I had sat through until sunrise. He looked uncomfortable, but not surprised. That hurt more than anything else. "What would you like me to say?" I asked softly. Nobody answered. Outside the window, a ferry moved slowly across the dark water. The lights shimmered behind it. The world continued exactly as it always had. Richard slid a pen toward me. "We can handle this tonight." I looked at the pen, then at the papers, then at my husband, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Freedom. Not because the marriage was ending. That marriage had ended long ago. Freedom because they believed they knew the entire story. Freedom because they thought there was nothing left to discover. Freedom because none of them understood why I had stayed all these years. Richard thought he was ending a chapter. Ethan thought he was protecting his father. Vanessa thought she was watching the final act of a predictable story. They were all wrong. 15 years earlier, a decision had changed the course of our family forever. A sacrifice had been made. A secret had been buried. And sitting there beneath the anniversary candles, staring at the divorce papers in front of me, I realized the truth was finally ready to come into the light. I did not sign the papers that night. I simply folded them, placed them back into the envelope, and set them beside my purse. Richard looked irritated by my calmness. He had always preferred clear reactions. Anger he could argue with. Tears he could dismiss. Silence made him uncomfortable. The dinner ended shortly after that. Nobody touched the anniversary cake. Nobody mentioned the 40 years we were supposed to be celebrating. We walked through the restaurant lobby together, but it felt as though we were strangers leaving separate events. Outside, the evening air was cool. A light breeze drifted in from the lake. Ethan hugged his father before heading toward the parking garage with Vanessa. Neither of them hugged me. Neither of them even looked back. I stood beside the valet station and watched their taillights disappear into the distance. Then I drove home alone. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. It was a beautiful house. Large, comfortable, filled with expensive furniture collected over decades. Yet it never felt emptier than it did that night. I placed the divorce papers on the kitchen counter and turned on a single light above the stove. The soft yellow glow illuminated the room where I had spent thousands of mornings preparing breakfasts, packing lunches, and waiting for family members who always seemed to be rushing somewhere else. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the table. The clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily. 11:15, 11:16, 11:17. Time moved the same way it always had, regardless of whether a marriage survived or collapsed. My eyes drifted toward a wooden cabinet near the dining room entrance. Inside that cabinet sat dozens of photo albums. Vacations, holidays, birthdays, school graduations. Evidence of a family that appeared happy from the outside. I knew better. The cracks had started long ago. 15 years earlier, Ethan had been 23, fresh out of college, full of energy, full of plans. Richard had been expanding his business rapidly during those years. He traveled constantly. Chicago, Dallas, Seattle, New York. Sometimes he spent more nights in hotels than at home. I rarely complained. Back then, I still believed sacrifice was part of marriage. Ethan had just accepted his first engineering position. I remember how proud he looked when he carried his first office badge into the house. He placed it on the kitchen table and grinned like a little boy. We celebrated with pizza and root beer floats. Simple things, the kind of moments that become priceless later. Then life changed. At first, the signs seemed small. Ethan canceled family dinners. He looked tired more often. He stopped going hiking with friends. His smile became less frequent. One afternoon, he came home and fell asleep on the living room couch before dinner. That had never happened before. A few weeks later, I found him sitting alone on the back patio, staring into the yard. He did not notice me standing in the doorway. He looked frightened, truly frightened. When I asked if something was wrong, he forced a smile and told me he was fine. Mothers learn to recognize lies, not because they are detectives, because they know the faces of their children better than anyone else. I knew something was happening. Richard dismissed my concerns. He said Ethan was adjusting to adulthood. He said young people work too hard these days. He said I worried too much. But a mother's instincts are stubborn things. They do not disappear simply because other people tell you to ignore them. One rainy Thursday morning, my telephone rang while I was grocery shopping. I still remember standing beside a display of apples when I answered. The voice on the other end introduced herself as someone from a medical office. She asked if I was Ethan Carter's mother. My heart immediately began to race. I left my card exactly where it was and hurried outside into the parking lot. By the time I reached my car, the world already felt different. I did not know it yet, but that phone call would begin a chain of events that would shape the next 15 years of my life. It would test every promise I had ever made as a mother. It would force choices I never imagined making. And eventually, it would become the secret that everyone sitting around that anniversary dinner table believed did not exist. The woman on the telephone spoke carefully, as though she understood that every word mattered. She asked me to verify a few details, then requested that I come to the medical center with Ethan the following morning. I remember gripping the steering wheel after the call ended and staring through the windshield at the gray clouds gathering above the parking lot. People pushed shopping carts around me. Cars came and went. Somewhere a child laughed. The world continued normally, while mine quietly shifted beneath my feet. That evening, I waited until Ethan came home from work. He looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped. Dark circles framed his eyes. He tried to smile when he saw me standing in the kitchen, but it did not reach his face. I asked him directly if there was something he had not told me. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sat down at the table and lowered his head. It was the first time I had seen my son look truly defeated. He admitted he had been undergoing medical tests for months. He said the doctors were concerned about a serious condition affecting his health. He insisted they were still gathering information and did not want the family to panic. I listened quietly while my heart felt heavier with every sentence. Richard arrived home later that night. Ethan repeated everything. My husband reacted differently than I expected. He asked practical questions. treatment options, specialists, costs, insurance coverage. Useful questions, certainly, but I noticed something missing. Fear. The kind of fear a parent feels when hearing that their child may be facing a major health crisis. I told myself everyone handles stress differently. At the time, I still gave Richard the benefit of the doubt. The next morning, we drove to the medical center together. Rain tapped softly against the windshield during the entire trip. Ethan sat beside me in silence. He stared out the passenger window while I kept both hands tightly wrapped around the steering wheel. Inside the building, everything smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. We checked in and waited. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, a physician invited us into a private office. I remember the diplomas hanging on the wall. I remember a photograph of a sailboat on a shelf. Strange details become unforgettable when life changes in an instant. The doctor explained that Ethan's condition was serious but manageable if the right steps were taken. Additional procedures might eventually be necessary. Monitoring would become part of his life. As the conversation continued, the doctor mentioned something unexpected. There could come a time when a family member might be asked to help in a very significant way. Ethan immediately shook his head and said he would never ask that of anyone. The doctor nodded respectfully, but I noticed the concern in his eyes. On the drive home, Ethan apologized repeatedly. He apologized for worrying me. He apologized for keeping secrets. He apologized for becoming a burden. I reached across the center console and squeezed his hand. A child never stops being your child, even when he is 23 years old, especially when he is 23 years old and frightened. Over the following months, life settled into a strange routine. Medical appointments appeared on calendars. Phone calls arrived at odd hours. Test results became dinner conversation. Through it all, I watched Ethan fight to remain optimistic. He continued working. He continued making plans for the future. He continued pretending everything was normal. But I could see the uncertainty hiding behind his smile. One evening, nearly 6 months after that first phone call, another conversation took place behind a closed office door. A conversation that would change everything. A conversation Richard never wanted anyone else to know about. And years later, it would become the very reason the truth waiting inside that envelope on my kitchen counter could no longer remain hidden. That conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Ethan was at work. I was folding laundry in the family room when Richard called and asked me to meet him at the medical center. His voice sounded unusual. Not frightened, not angry, just distant. I drove there immediately. The sky was clear for the first time in days, but I barely noticed. My thoughts stayed fixed on Ethan. When I arrived, Richard was sitting alone in a small consultation room. A folder rested on the table in front of him. He looked older than he had the week before. Tired. The physician entered a few minutes later and explained that Ethan's situation had become more complicated than originally expected. There were options. There was hope. But there was also uncertainty. The doctor spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. Then he explained that a close family member might be able to help significantly if future treatment required it. Medical compatibility testing could provide important answers. I remember glancing toward Richard. He stared at the folder without speaking. The room felt very quiet. Finally, the doctor asked whether we wanted to proceed with additional evaluations. Before I could answer, Richard spoke. He said we should wait. He said Ethan was young and strong. He said there was no reason to alarm him unnecessarily. The physician nodded politely, but I noticed the concern in his expression. After the appointment, Richard and I walked through the parking lot together. Cars passed. People carried coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued around us as though nothing important had happened. Halfway to our vehicle, Richard stopped walking. He looked at me and said something I never forgot. He said, "If this becomes serious, we need to be practical." Practical. It was such a simple word. Yet something about the way he said it unsettled me. That evening I sat awake long after everyone else had gone to bed. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards. I kept replaying the doctor's words in my mind. I kept thinking about Ethan, about the fear he tried so hard to hide, about the future he deserved to have. Over the next several weeks, I began accompanying him to more appointments. Sometimes we would stop for coffee afterward. Sometimes we would sit in my car and talk before he returned to work. Those conversations became precious. Ethan spoke about dreams he rarely shared with anyone else. He wanted a family someday. He wanted a house with a backyard. He wanted children running through sprinklers on hot summer afternoons. He wanted ordinary things, beautiful things. Listening to him, I realized how much was at stake. One afternoon, after another appointment, the physician requested a private meeting. He explained that further testing could answer important questions and potentially open opportunities if they were ever needed in the future. He stressed that nothing was guaranteed. Nothing was immediate, but preparation mattered. I agreed without hesitation. The process took time. Weeks turned into months. Paperwork accumulated. Appointments filled calendars. Through it all, Ethan remained unaware of many details. I wanted him focused on living his life rather than carrying additional burdens. Looking back now, that was the beginning of a secret I never intended to keep forever. It started with love. It started with hope. It started with a mother's determination to do whatever she could for her child. Eventually, the results arrived. I still remember the envelope. Plain white. Unremarkable, yet heavier than any letter I had ever held. The information inside would influence every major decision that followed. I sat alone at the kitchen table reading those pages while sunlight streamed through the window. Outside, birds moved between the trees in the backyard. Inside, my entire future quietly changed. When Richard came home that evening, I showed him the results. He read every page carefully. Then he lowered the documents and stared at me for a very long time. Neither of us spoke. We both understood what the papers meant. We both understood the sacrifice that might someday be required. And in that moment, Richard made me a promise that he would spend the next 15 years pretending he had never made. Richard promised that whatever happened, the truth would never be forgotten. He promised that if sacrifices were made for our family, they would be honored. He promised that Ethan would know one day. At the time, I believed him. After 40 years of marriage, trust had become a habit. Some habits are difficult to break. Life moved forward. Ethan's health gradually improved. The uncertainty that had once hovered over every family. Conversations slowly faded. Medical appointments became less frequent. The tension that had gripped our household began to loosen. For the first time in a long while, hope returned. Ethan smiled more often. He accepted a promotion at work. He started talking about the future again. A year later, he introduced us to Vanessa. She was charming, intelligent, ambitious. She spoke confidently and laughed easily. Ethan looked happier than I had seen him in years. Naturally, I welcomed her into our family. I hosted dinners. I helped plan holiday gatherings. I made every effort to ensure she felt included. In those early days, she often called me for advice. Sometimes we spent hours talking over coffee. Looking back now, those memories feel like photographs left too long in the sun. The images remain, but the colors have faded. As Ethan built his life with Vanessa, another change quietly took place. Richard became more distant. At first it was subtle. Longer hours at work. More business trips. Missed family dinners. Forgotten anniversaries. Small things that seemed easy to excuse. Then the distance grew. Conversations became shorter. Decisions became one-sided. He no longer asked what I thought. He simply informed me what had already been decided. The woman who had once been his partner gradually became an observer, standing at the edge of her own life. Whenever I tried to address it, Richard would dismiss my concerns. He said I worried too much. He said I imagined problems that did not exist. Over time, I stopped arguing. Not because he was right, because I was tired. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from explaining your value to people who no longer wish to see it. Years passed. Ethan and Vanessa married. Family gatherings became centered around them, then around their careers, their vacations, their plans, their achievements. I was happy for them, truly, but I also noticed a pattern. Whenever family stories were shared, important details disappeared. Contributions were forgotten. Sacrifices became invisible. Certain chapters were quietly removed from the narrative. One Thanksgiving, Ethan gave a heartfelt toast about the people who had supported him through difficult years. He thanked his father, his mentors, his friends. Everyone applauded. I smiled and applauded too. Yet as I sat there listening, I realized something strange. The story being celebrated no longer included me. Nobody intended cruelty. That was what made it hurt more. They simply assumed the foundation beneath their lives had always existed. Like electricity flowing through a wall. Like water coming from a faucet. Useful. Necessary. Unquestioned. Meanwhile, Richard never corrected the omissions. Never reminded anyone. never mentioned the promises he had made all those years ago. The envelope containing those records remained locked inside a fireproof box in the closet of my home office. Sometimes I would take it out and read the documents again. Not because I wanted recognition, because I wanted reassurance. Proof that the truth had actually happened. Proof that I had not imagined the sacrifices. One evening, nearly 15 years after that life-changing conversation, I opened the box again. As I sat reviewing the papers, my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen in over a decade. Dr. Alan Mercer, the physician who had guided our family through those difficult years. I answered immediately. His voice sounded older, but familiar. After a few moments of polite conversation, he said something that made my stomach tighten. He told me he would be retiring soon. Before leaving, there was something important he believed I needed to know. And according to him, it was time for certain secrets to stop being secrets. Dr. Mercer invited me to his office the following week. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Time has a way of shrinking places that once felt important. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room watching people come and go. Some carried folders. Others carried coffee cups. Everyone seemed to be moving toward the next chapter of their lives. I wondered if I was about to walk back into a chapter one had tried to leave behind. When the receptionist called my name, I followed her down a familiar hallway. Dr. Mercer greeted me warmly. His hair was completely gray now, and deep. Lines framed his eyes, but his voice carried the same calm confidence I remembered. He invited me to sit and closed the door behind us. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he opened a file resting on his desk. I immediately recognized my name on several pages. My stomach tightened. "Helen," he said gently, "there are things I assumed your family already knew." I remained silent. Something told me I needed to listen before asking questions. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents. Over the years, I occasionally asked Richard whether Ethan had been told the full story. The room suddenly felt very still. Each time, he assured me the conversation would happen when the timing was right. Dr. Mercer paused. Apparently, that conversation never happened. I stared at him. 15 years of memories seemed to shift at once. Small moments, strange comments, awkward silences, forgotten acknowledgments. They began arranging themselves into a different picture. "What exactly did Richard tell you?" I asked quietly. The doctor leaned back in his chair. "He told me he intended to protect everyone from unnecessary guilt." The word guilt landed heavily between us. Not responsibility, not gratitude, guilt. I thought about that for a long moment. Then I asked the question that had been building inside me since the phone call. "Why contact me now?" Dr. Mercer opened another folder and carefully removed several papers. "Because I am retiring. Because records change hands. Because people move away. And because some truths become harder to recover with time." He slid the documents across the desk. "I believed you deserved copies." I looked down at the pages. Official dates, signatures, medical evaluations, correspondence. Everything preserved with meticulous detail. Evidence of choices made years earlier. Evidence that certain promises had existed. For a moment I could not speak. Not because the information was new. Because it confirmed something I had spent years questioning. The sacrifice had been real. The commitments had been real. The promises had been real. Dr. Mercer watched quietly as I reviewed the paperwork. Finally, he spoke again. Families often rewrite history without realizing it. The people who carry the heaviest burdens are sometimes the first ones forgotten. His words stayed with me. After our meeting ended, I carried the folder to my car and sat behind the wheel for nearly 30 minutes. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. I did not start the engine. I simply stared at the documents resting on the passenger seat. That evening, when I returned home, I found Richard sitting in the family room watching television. He barely looked up when I entered. For the first time in many years, I studied him carefully. Not as a husband, not as a partner, as a man who had made choices. Important choices. Choices that shaped the lives of everyone around him. Then I noticed something unexpected. A message notification appeared on his phone resting beside the sofa. The screen lit briefly before going dark again. Most people would have ignored it. I did not. Because the sender's name was someone I had not heard mentioned in over 15 years. And seeing it suddenly made me realize that the story I believed was ending had another hidden chapter waiting to be uncovered. The name on the screen was Margaret Doyle, Richard's older sister. I had not spoken to Margaret in years. Not because we argued. Not because we disliked one another. Life had simply pulled us in different directions. Yet seeing her name appear on Richard's phone stirred something inside me. The notification vanished before I could read the message itself, but the timing felt strange. Very strange. Later that night, after Richard went upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen thinking about the past. Margaret had always been observant. She noticed details other people missed. During family gatherings, she often seemed to understand what everyone was feeling before they spoke. I remembered several occasions when she had started to ask questions about Ethan's difficult years only for Richard to quickly change the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now those memories felt different. The following morning, I made a decision. I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded surprised but warm. After exchanging pleasantries, I asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee. There was a pause. Not a long pause. Just long enough to tell me she already suspected why I was calling. 2 days later, we met at a small cafe overlooking the waterfront. The place smelled of fresh pastries and roasted coffee beans. Rain drifted softly against the windows while people worked on laptops and chatted quietly around us. Margaret arrived carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. The moment I saw it, I knew this was not a casual visit. We ordered coffee and found a table near the back. For several minutes, neither of us discussed the real reason we were there. Then Margaret placed the folder on the table and looked directly at me. "How much do you know?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. "About what?" I replied. She exhaled slowly. "About what Richard has hidden." I felt my pulse quicken. Margaret opened the folder. Inside were copies of letters, emails, and notes dating back more than a decade. She slid one document toward me. I recognized Richard's handwriting immediately. My hands became very still. "I found these after our mother's estate was settled," Margaret explained. "I kept them because something never felt right." I read silently. The letters referenced conversations about Ethan's health, family decisions, and promises made during those difficult years. Nothing dramatic. Nothing scandalous. Yet one pattern appeared repeatedly. Richard always minimized my role. Again and again. Whenever the subject turned to sacrifices, support, or difficult choices, he shifted attention elsewhere. Sometimes to circumstances. Sometimes to luck. Sometimes to himself. Never to me. Margaret watched my expression carefully. "I tried asking him about it years ago," she said. "He became defensive immediately." I looked up. "Why did you keep all of this?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because one day I thought someone might need the truth." The words settled heavily between us. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing documents. Piece by piece, a clearer picture emerged. Not of one terrible act. Something more painful. 15 years of gradual erasure. 15 years of allowing a false narrative to grow stronger while the real story quietly disappeared. By the time we finished, the rain had stopped. Sunlight reflected off the water outside. Margaret closed the folder and rested both hands on the table. "There is one more thing," she said softly. "Richard called me 3 weeks ago." I stared at her. "About the divorce?" She nodded. "He wanted reassurance." "Reassurance about what?" Margaret's expression darkened. "He wanted to know whether I thought anyone would remember what actually happened 15 years ago." For several seconds I could not speak. Then something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. For the first time, I understood why Richard seemed so determined to end our marriage quickly. The divorce was not simply about moving on. It was about controlling the final version of the story. And sitting there beside the harbor, with Margaret's folder resting between us, I realized he had made one critical mistake. He assumed he was the only person who still had evidence of the truth. When I returned home that afternoon, I carried Margaret's folder into my office and placed it beside the fireproof box. For several minutes, I simply stood there looking at both collections of documents. 15 years of records. 15 years of forgotten conversations. 15 years of evidence that the story my family believed was incomplete. The strange thing was that I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. Tired of silence. Tired of watching people build opinions based on half-truths. Tired of protecting a version of reality that had never protected me in return. 3 days later, Richard's attorney contacted mine regarding the divorce proceedings. A family meeting was proposed to discuss remaining details before everything moved forward. Richard wanted efficiency. He wanted closure. He wanted signatures. I agreed immediately. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Ethan and Vanessa's house. The morning of the gathering arrived bright and clear. Sunlight filled my kitchen while I prepared coffee. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Not because I knew what would happen, because I no longer feared what might happen. There is a certain peace that arrives when a person stops carrying secrets for other people. Shortly after 2 o'clock, I pulled into Ethan's driveway. Several cars were already there. Richard's vehicle, Vanessa's parents, Margaret's sedan. My attorney arrived a few minutes after I did. When I walked through the front door, conversations immediately quieted. Vanessa greeted me politely but cautiously. Ethan appeared nervous. Richard looked irritated. He probably assumed I had come prepared to negotiate. Instead, I came prepared to remember. Everyone gathered around the dining room table. Water glasses sat neatly beside folders and legal documents. Richard's attorney began reviewing routine matters. Property, accounts, timelines, procedures. The discussion remained civil, professional, predictable. Then Richard made a mistake. He looked across the table and said, "I think we can all agree Helen has already moved on from the past." The room fell silent. I turned toward him. "Which part of the past?" I asked calmly. Richard frowned. "There is no reason to revisit ancient history." My attorney glanced toward me. Margaret lowered her eyes. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I reached into my briefcase and removed a folder. Not the legal paperwork. The other folder. The one containing 15 years of truth. Richard recognized it immediately. The color drained from his face. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I saw it. Margaret saw it too. I opened the folder and placed several documents on the table. Ethan leaned forward. Vanessa looked confused. "What is this?" Ethan asked. I looked directly at my son. "The part of your life nobody ever explained." Richard immediately interrupted. "This is not relevant." His voice sounded sharper than before. Desperate. For the first time all afternoon, desperate. That reaction alone captured everyone's attention. Ethan stared at his father, then at me. "Relevant to what?" he asked quietly. I slid one document toward him. Then another. Then another. Medical records. Letters. Signed acknowledgments. Dates. Names. Facts. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exaggerated. Just truth. Preserved on paper. Ethan began reading. The room grew quieter with each page he turned. Vanessa stopped fidgeting. Margaret remained completely still. Richard looked away. Minutes passed. Nobody rushed him. Nobody interrupted. Finally, Ethan lowered the documents and stared at me. His eyes looked different now. Not angry. Not confused. Shocked. The kind of shock that comes when an entire chapter of your life suddenly acquires missing pages. "Mom," he whispered. "Is this real?" I met his gaze. Every word. Across the table, Richard closed his eyes. And for the first time in 15 years, the story he had spent so much effort controlling was no longer his to tell. For a long time, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room came from the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the passing seconds. Ethan continued staring at the documents spread across the table. His hands trembled slightly as he turned another page. Then another. Every answer he found seemed to create 10 new questions. Finally, he looked at Richard. "You knew all of this?" he asked quietly. Richard said nothing. He rubbed his forehead and stared at the table. That silence became its own answer. Ethan's eyes moved back to me. I could see memories rearranging themselves behind them. Conversations from years ago. Hospital visits. Missed details. Strange reactions. Pieces that never fit before suddenly finding their proper place. Vanessa reached for his hand, but even she looked stunned. Margaret sat quietly beside him, allowing the truth to settle naturally. Nobody needed speeches anymore. The documents spoke for themselves. "Why would nobody tell me?" Ethan finally asked. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I took a slow breath. "Because I never wanted you to carry a debt you could never repay." He blinked several times. "And Dad?" The question remained hanging in the air. Richard finally looked up. For the first time in years, he appeared uncertain. Not confident. Not in control. Just tired. "I thought I was protecting the family," he said. Ethan stared at him. "By erasing Mom from the story?" Richard had no answer. The room fell silent again. I realized then that I was not angry anymore. Somewhere along the way, the anger had disappeared. In its place stood clarity. The truth was finally visible. Whether people accepted it or not was no longer my responsibility. The meeting ended shortly afterward. No dramatic arguments followed. No shouting. No scenes. Just people quietly confronting reality. My attorney gathered the documents. Richard's attorney packed his briefcase. Vanessa's parents left first. Margaret hugged me before walking to her car. Ethan remained behind. As everyone else drifted away, he approached me slowly. For a moment, he looked exactly like the young man from 15 years ago sitting at my kitchen table, trying to hide his fear. "Mom," he said softly, "I do not know how to apologize for something I never knew." I smiled. A real smile this time. "Then do not apologize for the past," I replied. "Just learn from it." Tears filled his eyes, but he nodded. We stood there together for a few moments. Not repairing 15 years in a single conversation. Simply beginning. Sometimes that is enough. The divorce moved forward in the weeks that followed. Surprisingly, the process became easier once the truth surfaced. There were no more attempts to rush paperwork. No more efforts to control the narrative. Richard and I finalized everything with dignity. The marriage ended. The bitterness did not continue. I moved into a smaller home near the water. Every morning I drink coffee on the back porch and watch the sunrise reflect across the lake. It is a quieter life. A better one. Ethan visits often now. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with Vanessa. They ask questions. They listen. They remember. Not because I demand it. Because they finally understand. A few months after the divorce became official, I received a letter from Dr. Mercer congratulating me on what he called a rare victory. Not a legal victory. Not a financial one. A human one. I keep that letter in the same fireproof box that once held all those secrets. The difference is that the box is mostly empty now. Secrets lose their power when exposed to daylight. Looking back, I do not think I won because I uncovered evidence. I did not win because my marriage ended. I did not even win because people finally learned the truth. I won because I stopped protecting a version of history that excluded me. For 15 years, I carried a burden in silence because I believed love required it. Maybe sometimes it does. But respect requires honesty. And family requires memory. As I sit on my porch now, watching the evening sun disappear beyond the water, I understand something I wish I had learned years earlier. The people who truly love you should never have to discover your value after losing you. But if they do, make sure the truth is waiting for them when they finally open their eyes.